there is something that's built into the fabric of existence that tests us so severely in our faith about being itself that even God himself falls prey to the temptation to doubt.
Welcome back to another edition of Adam's Fall. In this episode, I'm going to ask a question. Why did Jesus say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" This is a quotation from Jesus on the cross that has puzzled Christians for centuries. I've often thought about it and have my own takes on it. And people have been puzzled as to why Jesus, who is God incarnate, according to traditional Christianity, could utter such a phrase, knowing that he was God. And so it's been a mystery for many centuries. Now, one thing that helped me come to a little more understanding of this, I think, is when I came across a quotation from a Catholic apologist, and that Jesus, in that moment, seemed for an instant to have become an atheist. Not totally, not that he actually was an atheist, but he experienced the dread and the loneliness and the bitterness and the abandonment of atheism in that moment. And an interesting commentary on this is actually from a conversation between Slavoj Zizek and Jordan Peterson. So I wanted to touch base on that conversation because it's really fascinating.
In other religions, you have God up there, we fall from God, and then we try to climb back through spiritual discipline, whatever, training, good deeds, and so on and so on. The formula of Christianity is a totally different one. As we philosophers would have put it, you don't climb to God. You are free in a Christian sense when you discover that the distance that separates you from God is inscribed into God himself. That's why I agree with those intelligent theologists, like my favorite, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, who said that the cross, the crucifixion, is something absolutely unique because in that moment of Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, God, Father, why have you abandoned me? For a brief moment, symbolically, God himself becomes an atheist in the sense of, you get a gap there. And that is something so absolutely unique. It means that you are not simply separated from God. Your separation from God is part of divinity itself.
I was very interested in your comments about Christ's atheism on the cross, that final moment of atheism. That's something I'd never thought about in that way.
Chesterton did. Yeah. Chesterton orthodoxy. A short book, excellent.
No, it's a very interesting thought because it's an unbelievably merciful idea in some sense. Yeah. That the burden of life is so unbearable. And you see in the Christian passion, of course, torture, unfair judgment by society, betrayal by friends, and then a low death. And so that's about as bad as it gets, right? Which is why it's an archetypal story, right? It's about as bad as it gets. And the story that you describe points out that it's so bad that even God himself might despair about the essential quality of being. Yeah. Right. So that is merciful in some sense because it does say that there is something that's built into the fabric of existence that tests us so severely in our faith about being itself that even God himself falls prey to the temptation to doubt.
Extremely interesting that, when we face the problem of evil, which I've done another video about, some ways it's very hard to come to terms with all the suffering, unjust, just, animal suffering, everything we see in the world. And sometimes there's no great answer for all these things, but we know that in the Christian passion, there is that Jesus was a co-sufferer, that he atoned in that he became one with humanity in humanity's struggle. And in this moment on the cross, did Jesus become one with the atheist? And he experienced loneliness, despair, dread, lack of a connection to the divine. And it's my intimation that he did, that he experienced this utter isolation, even though God was there, but God left him to his loneliness so that he could have compassion and empathy and experience what it was to not have that connection. And let's go to G.K. Chesterton's quote, which I really enjoy. This is from the book Orthodoxy, and if you have not read G.K. Chesterton, I highly advise you do. He says, "Nay, the matter grows too difficult for human speech, but let the atheists themselves choose a God. They will find only one divinity who ever uttered their isolation, only one religion in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist." And this is pretty fascinating, that only in Christianity is a divinity who seems to be divorced from himself, only one religion in which God seems to be abandoned. And this quotation actually comes from Psalm 22. And if we go to Psalm 22, we can see that it echoes the same comment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. And I urge you to read the whole psalm, as it's quite astonishing. But in the end of the psalm, interestingly, it turns from despair and anguish and abandonment to goodness and to being grateful for God. As we read, all the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to the dust will kneel before him. Those who cannot keep themselves alive. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to people yet unborn, he has done it. So in this moment of agony, Jesus is actually highlighting a quotation from Psalm 22. And in that Psalm 22 quotation, there is redemption in the end. So there's a little hint in this cry out from the cross that there will be a good ending. We know that Jesus, of course, died on the cross and was resurrected and defeated sin and death. And so the psalm, although starting out ominously and highlighting loneliness and despair, turns to glorification of God. And so we, in our loneliness and despair at times, can know in the end that things will turn out for good. And I wanted to conclude with a great thought on this moment by Jeffrey R. Holland, who's an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He has very good insight into this exact moment.
The idea of the Savior feeling that he was alone, probably to some extent in the garden when his disciples slept through the experience with him. He asked if they could just stay with him 1 hour, and they were pretty tired. They could hardly do that. And then on the cross, he cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Feels he's alone there. But certainly in terms of that relationship with his Father in heaven, I'm of the personal opinion that God was never, ever, ever closer to his only begotten Son than in that moment. However close that was, the Father was nowhere but at his side. But the Savior had to feel alone, because the whole nature of the atonement is that he had to carry the sins and the sorrows and the suffering and the sickness of all mankind on that one little set of shoulders. So he had to feel that he was alone, because he needs to know how you feel when you feel alone. He had to go the full distance, because there are lots of times when we feel we're alone. There are a lot of times when we feel we're abandoned. There are a lot of times when we feel the heavens are sealed. Well, he had to feel that too. And so he did. He was allowed to. It would have been an incomplete experience. It would have been an incomplete atonement if he hadn't experienced the whole gamut of sorrow and frustration and loneliness.
And I concur. That's a wonderful message by Jeffrey R. Holland. If we believe that Jesus did suffer an atonement, he became one with mankind, men and women and children and all of creation, then of course he had to suffer even abandonment. And in that moment on the cross, I'm convinced Jesus, for an instant, became nigh unto an atheist. He experienced that loneliness, that dread, that isolation, which I've experienced at times when I went through my periods of nihilism and abandonment of my religion and my faith. I experienced that same despair. And when I've come back to faith, to belief, I've been relieved of that. But I did experience that, and I know that Jesus, if we believe the Christian passion, must have had to experience that as well. And so that is my testimony. I look forward to your comments, and we'll touch base with you on the next video.